And we are live with our 143rd episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Seth Law, at Seth Law on Twitter, joined today by my lovely co-host, Stefan Edwards, at Logikill on Twitter. Stefan, say hi.
Hi.
Here we go. I'm trying to channel my inner CK Tricky, my inner Ken there. He's got his whole layout all smooth and yeah. As you may have noticed, Ken is not joining us today. He is off gallivanting across, some portion of I don't know, somewhere in the world. Decided that he didn't love us enough to dial in from an airport restroom or something like that, like Logikill would. Right?
Called from the backs of police cars and whatnot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. It takes real dedication to maintain such a high quality, entertaining podcast. That's all. The last week has been very eventful, both personally and across the industry. Obviously, this last week was DEFCON and Black Hat. And I'll be honest, I still feel a little hungover from everything because it's been, for those of you that don't know, I help out with DEFCON, the Hacker Tracker app, and we do all the scheduling and updates and events. And I always feel like I'm playing catch up when I get done with the conference because I don't actually watch a lot live as I'm trying to maintain. Like if you've ever organized a conference, you know that it's hard to stay up with the talks when everything else is going on. So there's a couple of things that we did definitely want to talk about today. Some of the past history, specifically around application security, but feel free to dive into Slack or YouTube if you've got a specific talk or something like that you want to bring up. I mean, Steph, I was going to ask you, as you were not on site, what was interesting to you outside of what we're going to talk about with HTTP2? Were there other things that popped up that were noticeable to you?
So I haven't seen anything that was really pressing for me. I think the interesting thing was watching Team Hashcat, participate in CTFs. A good friend of mine, Unix Ninja, he's pretty active in Team Hashcat. So listening to the ups and downs of Triumph there, and the usual the usual sort of undulations that you have during CTFs, where you're like, oh, this is going to be easy. Oh, nothing's going right. Like, oh, we're going to get it. Oh, shit, this is terrible. And then finally seeing them come out on top was pretty much the highlight of DEF CON for me, as it usually is.
Yeah.
It's fun to see friends participating in CTFs and whatnot there. So that's usually what I'm most interested in from DEF CON. So.
Yeah. And I mean, and the events, right? If no one's ever done DEF CON before, that's one of the things that I highly recommend, because you can catch all the talks. I just posted the list to the main stage talks from DEF CON. They always repost all that. There's the media server. You can torrent it all, pull it all down, watch it at a later date. But the events that are ongoing and live are super interesting, right? Get involved, try out your hand at a CTF. Right? The last couple of years, I've always jumped into command and control or some of the AppSec ones, right? Rather than doing the full blown, DEF CON ones. But it'd be interesting to see, did Hashcat do a write up on that, or have they even gotten to that point? I know it's early days yet after the conference.
Yeah, I don't think they generally do a full write up. I'll poke Unix Ninja and see, but I think they generally just take it and sort of add things to Hashcat and add things to their toolkit there. It's interesting to me because as someone who works in red team, as someone who sometimes has to crack passwords, that's usually the team that I go to for cracking. So it's always interesting to see what gives them, what speed ups they have, what tooling they have. So that's interesting. The other thing we're tracking internally at GitHub, we were talking about it. I think there were a couple Dorothy talks, or at least one Dorothy talk. Dorothy is a Kubernetes tool. Some of the talks have been released prior to Black Hat and DEF CON. But that was the other big thing that I want to catch up on is like what was talked about there, what was different from previously released talks, what's new there. I think there were a few Kate's talks and a few tools that were released. Robert, who works on the red team with me, he sent some links along to new new tools that we'll likely try out. So we have a backlog of tools as every year from DEFCON gives, but it's that sort of thing for us really.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know like in the demo labs, and it may have even been at Black Hat, the Kubernetes Goat was released this year, right? Which is that vulnerable install. I don't know. I still have these like weird a weird reaction to Kubernetes because most of the organizations I deal with, it's complete overkill, right?
Yeah.
And so
yeah.
Well, which is fine, right? But what were you going to say?
No, I was going to say Jay Beal, who I don't know his title at InGuardians because it's constantly Jay is some C-level position at InGuardian, usually like CTO or chief research officer or something like that. But Jay has Bust a Cube, which he released at KubeCon I think 2 years ago, and that's always an interesting training and interesting vulnerable Kubernetes app as well for these sorts of things. And then there were a few different Kate's tools. I think it's funny. I don't know if it would speak to Kate's maturity, but I think it speaks to we keep seeing this thing over and over again. So people are now starting to get to these are the vulnerable patterns. We no longer need to like watch Ian Coldwater's talks or Chris Gates's talks on this sort of stuff. We just sort of want to have a framework to pop Kate's boxes and that's it, or Kate's clusters and that's it.
Yep. Yeah, so. I mean, the maturity has definitely come a long way, right? As far as what I see, that I mean, I'm with you because that's a completely good thing, because those that start to use it that maybe shouldn't, at least those patterns are established, and we don't have to go down this whole. All right, like I mean, early days, it's back when mobile stuff first came out, and everybody's just ripping it apart on their own, trying to figure out what's going on, or web app days, but. I did get a question in Slack. They asked which tools you mentioned because they were lazy. You said Dorothy and what else?
Oh, Dorothy is the big one that I'm looking for. But we were also tracking like I was just looking it up in chat here. So we were looking at Zuthaka, which is a open source application designed to assist red team testing. And Cube Striker was the other one, which is a blazingly fast security auditing tool for Kate's.
Cube Striker, wow.
Yeah, I'll pull up. I
found the GitHub for Cube Striker. If you can find the one for Dorothy and
Dorothy's interesting because Dorothy is much more of a like holistic process. It's not necessarily for just for Kate's. I think Dorothy also has some work on Okta too. Okay. In fact, I may have. Yeah, it does Okta stuff using Dorothy. I'm just pulling it up using Dorothy for Okta monitoring and detection. So Dorothy, is Okta SSO visibility, and then there's a bunch of Kate's tools that I'll post here too. But
okay. Yeah, I'm dropping some of them in Slack for people, but we should put them in the YouTube channel as well because those are. There we go. I do see Dorothy.
Yeah, I'm pulling them up as we're chatting.
Yeah, we'll make sure to have all the links there for everyone. Oh, I did find it. Elastic.
GitHub stars are basically my new bookmarks. I check those before I speak because
there we go. GitHub stars. Yeah, that's right. You have to keep pumping GitHub now that you're a part of the board.
No, it's not that. I've actually always used GitHub stars. I have like 1,900 of them because there's just so many interesting things there. There's a lot of like really interesting projects, and I end up scrolling through the feed first thing in the morning. Bobby, who's also been on the podcast before, that was something he and I shared. It was like first thing in the morning is just scroll through what other people have starred and see what's up there,
Yeah. So. Well, that's what I'm looking at now. I'm looking at, okay, where are your stars, man? That's. Now I'm going to have to go review it. I'm going to jump down a rabbit hole. There's always new resources. Actually, Derek, that's probably one thing that you could add to your list of what's your Discord thing? I can't remember the name off the top of my head. I'm sorry. I'm failing you here.
Striker is there.
Oh, Get Informed, right? There's probably some GitHub. There we go. Get Informed. Yep.
Oh yeah, there's quite a bit. There's quite a bit of like digging in OSINT that can be done and should be done in GitHub repos currently.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of stuff that's in there as it is, right? Yeah, so there's Dorothy stuff, some Kubernetes Goat. Oh, I forgot to include that other one in there. Let me pull that last one. The Kube Striker
is really interesting too. I mean, all of the Goat applications are fairly fascinating. I think like Kube Goat, I haven't looked deeply at it, but it looked a lot closer to what you would actually see. I think like Goat, like OWASP Goat back in the day was not very close to what you would actually see in a lot of applications.
No. It was like, so like, go here, click this, look what happened, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Juice Shop definitely improved that. Juice Shop was actually what you would see in an Express application. Yeah. And I think Kate's Goat is relatively close to what you would see. Although I didn't dig in and see if they were doing something silly in there to facilitate this. But it's nice to see that there's vulnerable Kate's deployments, because I think that was the biggest thing. If you wanted to do this before, it was like stand up cop, walk through cops and see what's broken there. And there's all sorts of directions you can go with these sorts of things. And it's nice to see this. It would also be interesting to see like vulnerable, like AKS, vulnerable Azure Kubernetes service, that vulnerable like, GKS, that sort of thing. Because I think and hope most of the places you're going to see it are in cloud services rather than, on-prem deployments.
And that's what I would expect, right? Yeah. I mean, that's where I've seen it, as it hasn't been somebody doing it locally. It's they're spinning it up in GKS or wherever else. And that's, I mean, there are more nuances there, right? Like, because you are using Google or Amazon's infrastructure. Yeah. Anyway, the other thing that was interesting to me from a CTF perspective is the fact that, the ones that I was looking at in the AppSec space were all using AWS and like the cloud infrastructure for all their deployments now. There's not a lot that's self-hosted anymore. Like everyone's gone cloud, even like CTFs across the board. I know we've been moving that direction, but I don't think I hit anything that wasn't in Amazon at this point, right? When I was looking at the different CTFs that I did, unless somebody else ran into, I don't think the main DEFCON CTF was hosted in Amazon, but all the other sub ones, it just seems like the logical place to put a lot of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because you probably won't have some of the accidental issues that you often have when you have CTFs there.
Yeah.
I ran quite a few CTFs, in fact, and it's always challenging to make sure that you're actually doing the things that you want done in those. And hopefully cloud deployments will fix some of those sorts of things, with some more secure defaults. And also just not get pushed over, right? Like that's always the other issue, is so many people slam a CTF and then there's nothing left to access,
Yeah. And that's, I don't know. Like that's always the big challenge there, running the CTF. So it's a good thing. I don't know. Yeah. How many times have you restarted a box because it fell over because you only, allowed for 20 threads or something like that? Something crazy.
I think the worst one I ever had was I was running for B-Sides Charleston.
Mm-hmm.
So Paul Kerrer, Reaper Hulk on Twitter, he and I wrote up this crypto CTF. Paul did all the smart people stuff. I did the dumb people, like wiring things together part. And we deployed it on Alpine, and it passed the initial sniff test. But at the time, Alpine was still deploying with Libra, and it was missing some core crypto functionality. And Pi cryptography just fell over. So like midway through, I realized that you couldn't solve some of the crypto.
You couldn't actually solve the CTF with the.
So I'm like standing up a new box, pointing it at new things, like blah, blah, blah. That was honestly very funny. Only because building OpenSSL and deploying it was so painful versus just like standing up a whole new instance and going from there. So
yeah.
Yeah, it's funny how still in this that was in 2019 or so, but it's still funny how OpenSSL and compatibility bugs will bite you hard for simple things like that. So.
Yeah, I mean, anybody who has ever tried to actually build any of the like open source apps from scratch on GitHub, well, you'll know it, right? Like, just go try to build something like Bitcoin on your own, instance or something like that, and you'll run into, I'm sure, some sort of confusion or it's crazy. Listen, no, we should all go back to the days of doing our own Gentoo builds, right?
Those days are long gone. It's funny though.
But how will you know what's in your kernel there?
I mean, honestly, at this point, I haven't run like a make config on a Linux kernel in years. Honestly, it's probably been a good 10 years since I've done that.
Well, okay, well, that sounds like the next podcast that we have with you on is we're going to be like, how fast can Logikill build a Linux kernel?
I'll pull out the box that I still have it somewhere here. I'll pull out the box that I first did that on. It was like a Pentium 120 with like 32 megs of RAM.
It only took like 3 days to build, right?
Yeah. I had a Sun Spark box. I remember I tried generating a like 2048-bit SSH key, and it was like 3 hours later it got enough entropy to put the key together.
How do I increase entropy on something where I only have a keyboard? Where's the cat?
Yeah, it was quite awful. So I don't miss going back to those days.
No. Sorry, I'm dating both of us on today's podcast. We're talking about Spark stations and building our own Linux kernels, and when you were the CI/CD pipeline, right? That was the
Oh yeah. I mean, it's hilarious how far we've come. Like in some ways we've become much better, but the way that we've become better is terrible. Like we just ship a box to different locations, and that's how we become quote unquote better.
Well, no, I mean it's true, right? Like we stand it up in the cloud, but I even think about that from a like a red team perspective. Like like what's the easiest way to get on somebody's network? Oh well, here's a laptop, right? Just go plug this in, and then we'll get access to it, like physical access to that network or the VPN back. And we've got a lot of novel solutions for solving that stuff, for sure, right? The stuff that's worked. But we tend to make the same mistake. So this is also a good segue into HTTP2, right? So maybe we dive into that, what the new research is from James Kettle this last week. This was the one talk I had flagged because it is James Kettle, right? And he always puts a lot of good thought into things. So let me post that up. But actually, before we do that, let's dial back to the original research that was done on HTTP2, because you brought up a couple of good talks that happened a couple of years ago that are related, that James definitely builds on that, and he's looking at it from the lens of all of the the recent attacks that he's been doing with cache poisoning and everything else. But can you talk to those initially? Like, let's drop one of those in there.
Well, actually, before we get into that, there actually was just recently an article where they shipped a red team a base image of their laptop and said, do whatever you can do from here. So a fairly common like test style where you just ship a blank laptop. And that team detailed how they went from just like no creds, nothing but the laptop, which is supposed to connect back to things with the default image, all the way through to like detailed network access and everything there. I'll find it during this, but it was funny, and it's always interesting to see those sorts of assessments where you go from a base image. But the person I was thinking of is Brett Gravois. He spoke at NolaCon in 2018. He did a talk on HTTP2 and U. And then in 2019, he detailed WAF bypasses using HTTP2. And it was fascinating to me at the time because Brett, I think he's Crime Bears on Twitter. Brett was basically going around and seeing like what devices talk HTTP2 but don't actually do any filtering on HTTP2. Like they understand it and they can process it, but they do nothing security wise with it. And so it's fairly fascinating to see all of the things that accept protocols. Like this was back in the day in the noughties. It was like SCTP, right?
Okay.
Be all these filters for TCP/IP and UDP, and then stream control and transmission protocol would just be wide open. So or IPv6, there'd be all sorts of rules for IPv4 and no rules for IPv6. And so you would exfil that way. So Brett did sort of a holistic study of what accepts HTTP2 and then literally, provides no security on top of it. And it was an interesting talk to see what he found actually broke there.
Yeah. And like what I said about, all things being new again, right? Like that, it definitely feels like we reinvent the wheel. Every time we have a new tech, a new protocol that comes out, right? And I think that's what you're speaking to. That was one of the interesting things from James Kettle was this whole idea that, we've got all these Nginx servers that are out there that are accepting HTTP2, but then they turn around and use HTTP1 to talk to the rest of the infrastructure. And, the downgrade attacks that happen there, he's shoving HTTP1 definitions inside of that HTTP2 request. And then it's being processed on the back end because Nginx, I mean, just you can easily see how that happens. They're both plain text protocols. There's nothing there that would prevent someone from doing it unless you're watching for it. And I think this goes back to the WAF bypass stuff that you're looking at as well, or IPv6, IPv4. I mean, take your pick of protocol where we do this sort of, hey, everybody should upgrade to the new latest and greatest. Oh, wait, right? Like we haven't implemented firewall rules for, X or this protocol. And all of a sudden you've exposed your entire network to new people coming in.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because it's actually used like HTTP2 is used quite a bit, right? So if you've ever seen gRPC, that's all HTTP2 with protobufs built on top of it. There's quite a few apps are moving towards HTTP2, optimistically, right? And so there's a lot of exposure to HTTP2, and I don't think there really has been the sort of like concerted research effort to see what breaks with it, what we don't understand about it, and how we handle these sorts of things. And James did a great survey of like, this is what happens when you have an HTTP2 edge that talks to an HTTP1 internal side here. And it really did just seem like we're not treating the protocol correctly. We're not parsing things in ways that we should. We're not strict enough about a lot of these things. And it ends up with failures and edge cases there.
Yeah. Yep. And that's I mean, you start digging into the research and that's exactly what we're looking at is those edge cases. As developers, we have a tendency to make sure that functionality works. But as security people, right, it's the edge cases that kill us. And I don't know how to express that more succinctly, but this goes back to the days, right? Like we start talking about fuzz testing and everything else, that edge case testing that you and I like go off on, right? Whatever, like Ken calls it, the Crocs and socks of security, right? But it's all of these like, I mean, the application, we're holistically thinking of application of like as a circle or, of all the stuff that it does. But it's that the stuff, again, around the edge where we make the mistakes and we don't realize that it crosses a boundary, it crosses a trust boundary, it crosses a, functional boundary between two functions, and, introducing some variable in a non-standard way causes the application to crash or unintended consequences, and they have security implications. And I'm oversimplifying it immensely, right? But I don't know how to push that further along, right? When I'm talking to developers, trying to get them to understand that they need to do this edge case testing. I mean, do you have anything? I know you're doing more red team activities now, which is also a different set of edge cases, but like what sort of recommendations do you have when you're talking to these developers to actually push that direction?
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly a lot more towards like, hey, you do unit testing, so adding in property testing, which basically expands the surface area coverage, there would be quite helpful, right? And pushing them towards frameworks like Quick Check, or Hypothesis, or any of those sorts of things, which you and I have mentioned dozens of times on the podcast. Those sorts of things help quite a bit to just expand your coverage there. But I think with regard to like HTTP 2 to HTTP 1 and things like that, I don't think we realize that a lot of these things are very simple languages or very simple structural inputs. It's like, there's the Gang of Four. Like they have that whole book on like design patterns for object-oriented programming languages or object-oriented systems. And there's, Ola, who wrote the Functional Scala book, he said like the only good pattern in the Gang of Four is the interpreter pattern, because everything you do is basically a language. You consume some input and you act upon it as if it were a series of commands there. And we don't really understand that when we accept HTTP 2, that there could be a smuggled HTTP 1 request in there, and now we're mixing context. We're parsing data from two areas, and it's really just request smuggling all over again. I mean, it's complex and myriad, but it's the same sort of like schizophrenic parsing, schizophrenic access control things that we see all the time, unfortunately, in security.
Yeah.
So,
yep. Everything new or everything old is new again, right? That's the phrase.
Yeah, exactly.
I feel like a broken record because it is the case.
It's like meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Say it's the teacher,
Yes, exactly.
It's the exact same
no
thing.
one is listening. Yeah.
No, exactly. But it is very interesting to see how James ended up breaking things and how, and like the actual details of protocol orientation for HTTP 2. But unfortunately, like the things he's doing are just the usual things that we see in security. I mean, it's sad that we're back at this place,
Yeah. I mean, it is really quite sad. His introduction there, right? And I'm just kind of combing through the article that's on portswigger.net. And this is what he talked through during his talks as well that are up on YouTube. Like his introduction on HTTP 2 for hackers is good. If you're dealing with anything that is using HTTP 2, you should go in and read it, because it does differentiate between the two. It's pretty succinctly between, okay, what is the text-based protocol that is HTTP versus the binary protocol supposedly that is HTTP 2 that is just text-based represented. Man, I can't talk today. Yeah, and then how he smuggles that in there, the request smuggling, and then the other like access control issues that he's able to identify from that, and the exploits that he racked up. That was because he submitted quite a few bug bounty reports based on this research to, I can't even remember. It was Netflix. It was like 3 or 4 different places.
HuffPo. There was a few other. I think there's like the CMS behind HuffPo and a few other places. And it was also interesting too because he's like clearly issuing like CORS pre-flight requests and things like this, like things that the other problem with this is we don't have great visibility and telemetry into our applications, so we don't even know when they're issuing sudden requests to things that, hey, like in the history of Netflix, we've never, or the history of HuffPo or whatever it was, we've never issued a request to this, like, definitely malicious.com.
Yeah.
And we don't have baselines to know, like, we shouldn't be doing this. We've never done this before. Why are we suddenly doing it now? And it's like, it's very interesting to me to see, like, how far we haven't come in certain things,
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is, right? And I don't know. I mean, that it goes back to my nihilism on it, right? Like, because I'm like, it does feel like we come a long way, and then it's what, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, as we push some of this new tech. And does HTTP2 really give us that much more? Like, did we really need that on top of HTTP1?
Well, the weird thing about HTTP2 is it's so I don't think HTTP2 is actually the more interesting one. Where it becomes more interesting is HTTP3, which is quick. QUIC. Quick actually delivers over UDP. It uses a reliable, durable UDP delivery mechanism. And so I think HTTP2 is just the interstitial. It's like John Wick 3 and John Wick 4. Like they deliver no content, but they get you to the end movie, I think HTTP2 solves some of the server-side push, server-side content delivery, streaming, etc. things that we had issues with in HTTP1 content contention. But I think the real end goal is going to be quick, it will be interesting too.
Yeah, let me post up just the Wikipedia article on quick, because it is super interesting how we're moving slowly along to this new delivery mechanism.
Well, yeah, and Google already uses it. That's what's always interesting to me, is like when HTTP2 was speedy and and Chrome was really the only browser that did this. I know there's some before I hear it, there is some difference between speedy and HTTP2, but when speedy was the thing and Google was just sort of testing this, it's like all of a sudden we have a new protocol flying over our wires here internally at our enterprise or whatever, and content inspection or whatever is just not there. And we have reasonably good rules for TCP and HTTP and whatnot, but now suddenly we're going to have a new wire protocol and a new transport protocol that are very different, and they use DTLS. They don't use TLS proper. So there's all sorts of new interesting edge cases I'm sure we'll find there. And it's going to be very fascinating to see. But I don't think HTTP2 does anything but get us to quick.
Yeah. I mean, an interested, What I keep going back to is what do we need to. So as a developer that's creating some sort of front end application or front end API, like these are all just delivery mechanisms to me, right? Most of this is magic, like voodoo behind the scenes. Honestly, to probably 90% of the developers that are out there, they're never going to deal with HTTP1, much less HTTP2 or quick right now. And so it's hard to like represent something like this in a report to the developers that have nothing to do with it, right? Like you start talking to the sysadmins that are running Apache or Nginx or whatever proxies or whatever firewalls. Yeah,
there's no sysadmins anymore. They're all dead.
They're all dead. Yeah. To whatever CI/CD pipeline is pushing this out, right? Like, or DevOps, and so what is it like that? Like, what is it that they have to be aware of here outside of there is this huge like gap, or there's these problems, and then this also ends up going back to bug bounty research. When you find something like what James has done, this is novel research. It's awesome and it makes us more secure, but no one else was aware of it now until like James or these other talks came out. So how do you protect yourself from something you know nothing about is basically my question, outside of staying on top of the research.
And I think that the biggest issue for devs and for folks listening here, because we have more security testers and security blue team than actual devs that listen to AppSec. But yeah, I think it's understanding your attack surface. If you're a red teamer or a pen tester, checking right away if the system under test actually accepts HTTP2 and seeing if you can smuggle requests to backend. I think we are in for a couple years of really easy, like, I pwned you sort of like time for red team pen testers. And I think
so Kettle just gave us another, tool to do that.
Yeah. And I think for bug bounty folks listening, like, this is going to quickly become, look, very often bug bounty folks specialize in like a handful of techniques and they just like apply them across bug bounty programs. And I think we're literally going to see someone weaponize a lot of this stuff and just see if they can spray, internal infrastructure with this sort of stuff. I don't think we're going to are like external attackers going to start doing this stuff? Probably some actors will use it. Probably some sorts of attacks will warrant it. But I think mostly we're going to see, pen testers, red teamers, and bug bounty folks spraying this all over and getting easy wins until blue team has enough time to like catalog what's using HTTP2, figuring out what infrastructure is not patched, what infrastructure even talks this protocol, where does it live, how do they fix it, etc. I think that's the real takeaway I took from this, and maybe that's me being cynical, but
Well, and as much crap as I get for it, right? Like knowing what your application does and what a normal day looks like goes miles, right? So if you're not logging, yeah, okay, I'm back to logging, right? I always circle back. But if you're not actually monitoring your app and your infrastructure for behavior, you should be, and this is where you should start, right? Is, hey, what is it? Yeah, like what are the indicators that your application would have been hacked, right? We talked about that from a forensic perspective. What are the indicators of compromise? If you haven't put that thought into your application, and into the monitoring and logging that goes into it, this is a good place for you to start. What does it look like when someone compromises account? What does it look like when someone is trying to brute force, a password or, credentials for your application? Can you tell? Because if you can't, then your monitoring is insufficient. You should probably turn that leaf over and start looking at other mechanisms to do that.
Yeah. Oh, and I see you posted the same link that I just posted in there. Thank you very much, Derek, for actually finding that for us. But I agree. What's funny though? I was just thinking as you were mentioning that, Seth, like it was, I want to say probably almost 10 years ago now. I remember there was an app that had this like super fancy, at the time, WAF. It did all this stuff. But the old person's version of doing this attack was you would try HTTP 1.1, you might try HTTP 1.0, and then what most people don't remember is there's actually an HTTP 0.9, which is only GET and a handful of headers, and that was it. And a bunch of stuff back in the day used to be like HTTP 0.9, that request can go through, but then the application would treat it as HTTP 1.1 because it had no knowledge of HTTP 0.9. So you basically bypass all of these fancy rules, fancy scanning engines, all this sort of stuff. And it's just like we're back in the same place where you can stuff credentials or stuff requests into another request because something doesn't understand and it just blindly fails open.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I mean, you start. I always go back to the early days of Apache and like the proxy engines that were built, or the proxy modules that were built into that, because that's exactly what we were talking about, right? 0.9 was accepted, and I mean the WAFs that initially came out only spoke HTTP 1.1, and so if they had a proxy module in place, all you had to do was request with 0.9, and okay, all right, well I'll just proxy that along because obviously it's safe, right? Obviously, no one would ever screw with any of that shit.
Yeah, who would pass along a request payload that didn't match 0.9, even though the only thing 0.9 about this thing is the version that you put in the request line. That's it. Yeah, I mean it feels like we haven't made any real progress in that space. Where you would see interesting stuff is like Nginx has. If you ever look at the source code for Nginx has very strict decision trees for all of it. And I know I talk about formal methods every single time I come on this podcast, but that decision trees are a type of formal method. They are a mechanism for like laying out how you are parsing a problem and handling a problem. And Nginx has had less of these sorts of things because it handles things as strictly as possible. But as a dev, it's like you have to know what you're, or as a responder, I should say, or a defender, to use OWASP terms. As a defender, you really do have to know what protocols are flying over the wire and what things are actually happening there. Otherwise, without baselines, how the heck are you going to know what your app is actually doing or supposed to be doing?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I look at those decision trees too. How many developers are actually looking at Nginx configuration outside of, hey, how do I get this up on, port 3000 or whatever, right? Like, how do I redirect traffic to my application? Most of them are not going to the level of configuring Nginx. They just aren't.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody's doing that on the DevOps team, and it's all about how quickly can I expose this. I would be surprised if even 10% of the installations of Nginx installations that are out there use those decision trees in a proper manner, right?
Yeah, but I mean, as devs, you can use the same sort of stuff yourself, right? And like when this happens, we expect this, just graph it out. But as we've talked about before, people don't necessarily threat model or process their applications in this way and know what it's supposed to be doing. It's just sort of like a miasma of what we do, and that's it.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, to your point about the blue teamers and the defenders, this is probably where security needs to step in. If your organization is large enough that you have, the separation between DevOps and developers and security, you're the ones that have to think of this, right? You're the ones that have to go in and say, hey, I know that there is this separation of duties between these two pieces of our organization. That means that is a gap that can be exploited. And this is always what we've done from a web AppSec or an AppSec perspective, is we're looking for those gaps where developers take the easy way out, or, they're using a framework, or basically just doing something as quickly as possible to push out for functional or business sake. Those are the gaps that we're actually able to exploit. And it's usually up to the security team or the ProdSec team to identify that gap actually exists and test it. I know that's a lot to put on them, but it's your job, right? I guess. Right?
Well, it's hard too, because if you don't even know that HTTP2 is being consumed, then you're just like, I curl my application, although curl will upgrade to HTTP2 when possible. But I curl my app, it looks fine. We have Tenable scanning engine in here, and it does its thing. And you don't even realize that there's a whole other protocol lurking there that no one has visibility on until suddenly a browser switches it on and everyone's using HTTP2. I mean, you can be caught off guard and have done everything else right. It's like I usually say, blue team has a much harder job, because as a red teamer, I only have to be right once. I mean, I can be right across an entire thing, but I only have to be right once, really. Whereas blue team has to be right every single time across the entire structure of your infrastructure and the entire structure of your application. And one minor thing, and all of a sudden I'm exposing something I shouldn't have. I am pivoting in a way I shouldn't be able to pivot. And this HTTP2 bug set is just the same thing.
Yeah. Yep. And in Slack channel too, right? Toaster32 was talking about it, right? That hopefully you have enough communications between security and dev to catch those config issues early before production, then give them tools to check, validate themselves. And I think that's important. The point about giving them tools, giving them the ability to go in and do that. But from a developer, sorry, a call came in and it just threw off my thought. But from a strict like red team perspective, you're absolutely right. You've got, this is always the hard thing about being a defender or trying to, build out logs for your application or develop your application and protect against everything that's out there. Is you make one mistake and you can be exploited, is really what it boils down to. This is why everyone wants to be on the red team side of things from security, especially when they get started, because it's fun to pop boxes. It is, right?
Yeah.
Like a nice little, Yeah, it
We push
dopamine hit
over
when
people's
that.
Legos.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, on the developer side, and then I also understand on the other side where you get so defensive because you've spent all this time and you thought you've done a good job in developing this functionality, this application, and then somebody walks in and it's like, haha, SQL injection, you know what I mean? And you're like, ugh, I have to know everything to develop this, so I'm going to just go depend on Nginx to handle everything else because I just don't have the capacity to do that, which is it's a valid argument, right? Like it's a valid way to go about developing an application. So,
well, I honestly would state that if your developers are worrying about the protocol, especially for web applications, and you're not like a mobile device or you're not a IoT device or something like that, it's probably an abstraction leak. They should be focusing on they should be focusing on what is the flow, what's the request that comes in, what parameters do I need to see, etc. And if they're focusing on like, oh, do we support HTTP 2 or HTTP 1.1? And again, you're outside of like mobile devices and things like that. Probably not the like. There's something probably failing in your process, or you're trying to like push something off on the devs, or unfortunately, from my experience, they're trying to like upgrade someone who has a device somewhere interstitially that is, ancient in between. What do you mean anything beyond HTTP 1.0? It's fine. TLS 1.0, that's fine too, right? Like we don't need it.
No. SSLv2, right? That's
Oh my
top of the
gosh.
line, right?
Actually, SSLv3. That's the worst one that you can roll out there. But yeah, I mean, it's very difficult for devs. This is outside of their domain of expertise most of the time, and honestly, worrying about it is I don't want to say we should push this back onto server, like actual daemon makers and things like that. But I do think the Nginx approach of like very strictly designed consumption, very strictly designed parsing is really the only thing that's going to save us in these sorts of instances. And we should be replicating that across the industry. It's not dev's fault if HTTP 2 is supported in here. It's really the daemon makers that we have to push this back on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, it is the daemon makers. You think about the pipeline to actually serve up an application, and yes, the application's sitting on layer 7, right? Somewhere along the lines, it gets passed data. It doesn't care if it's HTTP 1, 2, quick, right? Like it knows what's input, what's output. It's sitting on top of some sort of an application server that is then proxying traffic from a web server that depends on the routers and everything else along those lines. And it's easy to see where, okay, there's one piece that's in that line to the whole request smuggling or downgrading from HTTP 2 to 1. Like there's always going to be a component in there that doesn't understand it, right? Like if and it's probably something that your business or your company has paid thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to implement, 5 years ago. They don't want to throw it away because it provides some sort of value. And so then all of a sudden you're looking at daemon makers and you're looking at hardware like your F5 boxes. Do they support this? How are they actually handling it? It's not on the application developers to upgrade those devices in most organizations, or even know that those devices exist. It's dependent on all that. There's so many dependencies and there's so much abstraction that's going on in most development nowadays. It feels like, again, going back to AppSec nihilism, it feels like a lost cause, right? Yes, we'll get there, but by the time we get to HTTP 2, that means Quick's going to be out. That means that 3 is going to be out, and we're already behind the curve. And without throwing everything away and starting fresh, it's hard to catch back up there. And no company wants to lose that investment, right?
No, and I think as devs, the real thing that you can take away from this is knowing when you should be issuing requests and making sure that you're validating any of those requests if you are fooled out. I mean, there's really nothing else you can do as a dev. Some of the things that some of the things that James was pointing out, like maybe if they were a little stricter about redirects and maybe they were a little stricter about what they're processing, that would have been saved. But like the request stuffing and the request smuggling stuff that he's showing, I mean, it's difficult to, it's difficult to actually fix that sort of thing as a dev, you know?
Yeah. No. It goes back exactly what you're saying to the daemon makers, to Nginx or Apache or whoever is developing that front end tech that's being used. I mean, or CloudFront, whoever, right? Cloudflare, whatever tech that you've got, that's first layer there, needs to be looking at the structure of the payload as it comes in and eliminating that sort of a threat. Now that they know about it, you know that those companies are jumping on it, right? You know that it's going to be built in there, and at some layer, at some level, or at some point in the future, we probably don't have to be concerned quite as much about it. But to your previous point, for the next 6 months to a year, it's going to be greenfield for a lot of the researchers that are out there.
Yeah, I feel bad for our bounty support team at GitHub. I feel bad for like hug ops to folks who have to do front end bounty support, because you're going to be seeing this sort of thing quite a bit coming up the next 6 months. It's also funny. I write in ReasonML. It's a OCaml-like programming language that compiles to OCaml and then to JavaScript or OCaml on the back end. I do quite a bit of work with it, and I needed to do a bunch of strings processing this weekend for something for work, but I was interested in it, and so I was working on it over the weekend. And I realized that the strings module and string parsing in general in Reason is broken. There's like several fundamental issues with it. And I started tracing back through the code, and that code has existed for quite some time, potentially years at this point. And it looks like just no one has run into it before, So you also can have that effect where we rely on these open source supply chain things. We rely on this open source software, and it does the thing. And then if just no one uses it until you do, you also can run into those sorts of issues here too, which HTTP2 is another great example of that sort of stuff,
Yeah. Well, and I don't know, it's all a house of cards at some level, right?
Yeah.
The way that open source actually supports the internet at large and what we're trying to do, right? Like, yes, we have large projects, and yes, a lot of those are funded, but you'd be surprised at the number of libraries that those large projects use. That is two guys that are posting to GitHub that have, daytime jobs and, can't really get to it except on a weekend or, whatever else. And so when something breaks and people complain too loudly that it breaks, they don't realize that they're not talking to a professional, supported developer that's doing this because someone's paying them. He's doing it because he found an interesting project, started something in school, and now everybody and their dog uses it, and then left pad happens, right? That's,
Yeah. Yeah, and there's so many things that rely upon unpaid developers, and there's so much unkindness to unpaid devs as well. So it's like, we have to support these protocols. People want this support, but then when it actually comes down to like rubber meets the road, there's some college kid or there's some person who's working on this at night, and now all of a sudden they have to figure out how to support like HTTP2 and correctly and get it parsed. And oh, by the way, don't have request smuggling there either.
yeah, exactly. Like that was the last thing they were thinking of, because they had their like master's thesis that's due in the next 2 weeks, and they're like, oh, okay, well, I'll just shove this out really quick because somebody wanted support for it. It's I don't know, it's an interesting problem. I mean, this came up over the last week when I was at DEF CON. We were having a lot of discussions about developers that support these open source projects and the software supply chain attacks, and taking over of like known projects, and the trust that we give to developers. I don't think we understand that a lot of times, or to these people that are like unpaid positions. It just is, yeah. Again, it's a little nihilistic, right? We make the same mistakes because of the conditions that we've put ourselves under.
You mean that the random person who with an anime avatar and like some reference to some sort of like, you know, maybe potentially semi-illegal act, whose software I rely upon is maybe potentially not trustworthy? Like, you know, I shouldn't build my entire company off of that. Is that what you're saying?
Maybe not, right? Like it just depends on, you know.
Yeah.
It depends on what your threat profile is, right? Like as long as you understand that that's who you're trusting, that's great, right?
Well, I know supply chain security stuff is like super hot right now, like the Mugatu, like so hot right now. But
Yeah,
I mean,
so
it's like it's very funny because a lot of this stuff is like identifying risk, identifying locations there, identifying open source trustworthiness. But I haven't seen anything that's like, how do we pay developers to like respond to security incidents for this stuff? Like, you know, the actual thing that will fix this is like reputation systems, you know, paying developers to work on this stuff, paying developers for, you know, maturity, open source maturity more generally. And like, I haven't seen too much that actually wants to deal with that side of it. It's all the like, how do we beat down on open source developers to fucking fix everything again? Those jerks, you know, it's like, well,
yeah.
thanks, you know?
Yeah. I mean, the closest, you know, to GitHub's credit, right. The ability to sponsor, you know, open source devs now. I mean, I think that goes, at least there's some mechanisms that are there. I think partially though, it goes back to kind of this recognition that people are developing this and you are depending upon it, right? Especially as an organization and like as a business, you know, if it's critical to your organization, you should probably be like throwing some money at those developers so that when a problem occurs, they have the capacity to handle it. Because if you don't, you're at the mercy of, right, this new tool that James Kettle just put out, and the bug bounty researchers. You're going to be paying the exploiters rather than the developers themselves, which is usually what happens. I think there's more money in bug bounty research than there is in, hey, I'm going to go and fix this. And that goes back to the Hunter 2, or not Hunter 2, is that who it is? The guys that are doing, I think it is Hunter 2 devs that are doing, hey, we're going to pay developers to fix, or pay people to fix vulnerabilities in open source code. But the money, if you look at how much they have to pay out to developers, is so minuscule in comparison to, hey, I go find this vulnerability and I exploit it at Google and they pay me $5,000, or I can go fix it for $50, right? Like that is the sort of like level of comparison that we're talking about. So what are you going to do as someone that has 2 hours? You're going to go exploit it, right? You're going to go find the money that way, because fixing it is, you know, it's going to take away that exploitation factor for you.
Well, the funny thing is, even in government, if you look at like, you know, budgets for defense, like actual defense, I don't mean the Defense Department, I mean actual like network defense operations, computer network defense, whatever you want to call it. Like those budgets are dwarfed, just absolutely like minuscule compared to like, I want to buy all the hot new stuff, like give me all the weapons and things like that. Like those budgets are absolutely minuscule to defend against these things, to research defensive techniques, to you know, make things better. That there's very little money in that versus like, I want to do the open source hotness. I want to do the breaking side. Like you can make a ton of money in that, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it's not a new problem either.
Now,
right? Like, you know, if I go back to my initial like security days at, you know, the bank, you know, 20 years ago, that was the same issue that we had with our CISO at the time, as he would go out and pay tens and hundreds of $1,000s for like Metasploit, but wouldn't give us money to actually do research and like implement a WAF properly, right? Like it was just like, oh, well, this was fun, and I saw this in a presentation, and look what you can do with it. And we're like, yeah, but like we have no way to protect against it. So why are we paying for this tool when, there's not the money available, or you're not willing to staff up on the other side?
No, you have to get all the hot, cool things all the time. And that's all that really matters there. No, I mean, it's the same thing. When I was a dev, I remember I wrote a replacement for PIL, the Python image library. And it was like, all it did was it could take an arbitrary image file and return width and height and what type of file it was. That was it.
Yeah.
And so you didn't have to include all of PIL. You just included this one Python library. And I remember a very large multinational corporation came to me and was like, hey, can you support some crappy format that I didn't want to? I was like, not a problem. Just issue a PR and we'll get it going. And their response was, well, can't you do that? I was like, no. Like, I have other stuff to do. Like, I don't give a crap about your like terrible format. Like, you go do that, and then I will add it to my software.
Yeah.
And it was like weeks of pushback. And then finally I was like, I will do it for you for, I said something like $5,000. And like, that's so much money. And it was like, what do you think? Like, this is actual time. Yeah. But we're not dealing with any of the actual supply chain issues. We're not dealing with a lot of this stuff. And James did great work here. But I think it just points to like, there's a lot in our supply chain. There's a lot in our stack that we just don't understand, and it just exists, and we're going to get in trouble for it.
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, take HTTP2, spin that into Quick. Let's go see what else is available, because I'm pretty sure there's the same sort of downgrade attacks there, right? The same sort of request smuggling. I'm sure it exists. And somebody's going to eventually get to that, right? Whether that's James or somebody else, it wouldn't surprise me if he moves on and looks at that next. So. But yeah.
I was just going to say, I think like even just scanning your network, like scanning all of your web boxes to see if they support HTTP2, and then try like seeing what responds to other requests in there is probably going to, it will save a lot of pain in a lot of these sorts of things. So,
yep. Yeah, definitely. So that's the takeaway that you should go with if you're, in that space. Make sure that the developers understand, number one, what their application is running on top of. And then number two, you need to understand as a security person or a security developer, what exploits are available and what kind of that asset inventory or software supply chain looks like, so that you can fix it when it pops up. So.
Yeah, and also Toaster brought up a good point in Slack. If you're interested in writing tools, writing a proxy that is quick aware currently, that is trivial to set up and can do DTLS inspection, not TLS, but DTLS, datagram TLS inspection, is probably going to get you some spotlight time really quick if you're interested in doing that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I'm sure it'll get into Portswigger, or it'll get into Burp Suite eventually.
Well, it's like
do it, right? Because it'd be an awesome project. With all our extra time that we have, I'm sure you and I will get to it, right?
Well, it's like Nope for Burp. If you've ever seen that, it's like the non-HTTP proxy extension for Burp. It's out there. You can use it. I'm sure someone will wedge it into Burp until Portswigger adds it themselves natively. But it's also like there may be a space for custom-made tools here, or fixing Fiddler to support it. Remember Fiddler?
Yeah. No. Web Scarab, because I don't think it'd be a problem to implement that in Java. No. Old versions of Java, right?
Yeah. It's funny too, because to this day, like Fiddler still has the best like HTTPS or TLS proxy like niceties for Windows. Honestly, there's nothing that really just like it's push button and does all the things. Well,
it's built.
Yeah,
but custom for Windows, so there you go, right?
But you have to use Windows. So that's
we all stuck.
Hell.
No. Go to Mallory, right? That proxy that was super easy to use, right?
Charles proxy. Oh my
Charles,
gosh. Goodness. Anyway. But apparently Portswigger is looking at this sort of thing. They have a paper or a blog from 2020 that they updated in June of this year that is talking about Quick. So they're tracking it. I guess it won't be the traditional lag with Quick or with protocols in Burp. So it should be nice. HTTP2 took a number of years to actually land in Burp. So
yeah. So, well, yeah, we'll see when it actually goes, and but at the current state, right? Like it's probably a lot of manual stuff to test anything that's quick right now. So,
Yeah.
anyway, we have been going for over an hour, Stefan, as usual, like all over the place. But I appreciate you coming on and
Absolutely.
helping co-host. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else right now. I don't think there's a lot of announcements because DEF CON is kind of over. And but as always, if you've got questions, please join the conversation either on Slack or on Twitter. We'd love to, have your thoughts, have your input into what's going on with the show. And yeah, you can find us there. Any last minute thoughts, Logi, before we call it today?
I was going to say it's always a good show when you and I are both like existentially exhausted and tired and like stuck with brain fog in order to talk about stuff. That's always a good show. So if it was coherent, that's all I hope for.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we were.
That's what you and I have always said when we were incoherent, though.
I don't know what you're talking about. I'm always coherent, always.
But no, I think that was perfect summation there, Seth.
Yeah. Yep. So thanks everybody for joining today, and we will catch you all next week. Yeah, but appreciate it. Thanks.